Hello, this is John Seidel, the director of the Seung-Ook Hawk Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE. Welcome to Dialogues on Southeast Asia. Drawing on a wide range of research undertaken by experts on Southeast Asia, this podcast aims to provide specialist expertise and an interdisciplinary approach to the understanding of key issues and challenges across the region. Dialogues on Southeast Asia brings you discussions and debates with specialists in diverse disciplines and with different kinds of expertise on the countries of the region and on Southeast Asia as a whole. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Hyun-Ban Shin, Professor of Geography and Urban Studies in the Department of Geography and Environment here at LSE. On behalf of the Seung-Ook Hawk Southeast Asia Center, I'd like to welcome all of you joining us today. This is an inaugural seminar for the new Inter-Asia Seminar Series, which is a new initiative at the LSE to promote Inter-Asia dialogues on key regional affairs. The series is jointly convened by Professor Chun Lin at the Department of Government, Professor Bing-Chun Mong at the Department of Media and Communications, and myself. It's kindly supported by the Seung-Ook Hawk Southeast Asia Center, for which the conveners are very grateful. For this inaugural seminar, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Seung-Ook Lee, Professor Nianshen Song, and Chelsea Ngoc Minh Nguyen for the Inter-Asia Seminar Series on the topic of Cold War and Asia modernity. Before we start, a few housekeeping points about this seminar. This event is being recorded today and will be disseminated later, subject to no technical difficulties. Please post any question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll try to ensure there are at least 15 minutes towards the end of the session today for Q&As. When you post your questions for Q&A, please include your name, affiliation, location, and also your question. There will be an example in the Q&A box for you to consult. We also have many more exciting events for your attention, which will be happening in the spring term of LSE after the spring break. In particular, we'll be hosting Nick Beasley from La Trobe University, who is going to be discussing reglobalization, geopolitics, and Southeast Asia. This is going to happen on the 29th of April at LSE. There will also be LSE Southeast Asia Forum, an annual flagship event that will discuss the challenges of sustainable growth in Southeast Asia, and this will be on the 23rd of May. The center will be inviting 4 experts on the economies of the region to discuss the challenges affecting the region of Southeast Asia. So please do pay a visit to our event webpage of the center and register yourself to be part of these events. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. First, we have Dr. Seung-Ook Lee, who is an associate professor at the School of Digital Humanities and Computational Social Sciences at Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea. Dr. Lee specialized in urban and political geography with a focus on the political economy in East Asia, particularly in China and on the Korean Peninsula. Seung-Ok is also joint researcher at the Center for Asian Studies and Society at Seoul National University, where he has been conducting research on special economic zones and military-based cities in East Asia. Next, we have Professor Nianshen Song, who is a professor at the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences at Tsinghua University in China. Nianshen is specialized in modern Chinese and East Asian histories, frontier and ethnicities, and global history. He also holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and an MSc in comparative politics from the LSE, so welcome back to the school. His recent publications include books such as Making Borders in Modern East Asia, the Tumen River Demarcations, 1881 to 1919, which came out from Cambridge University Press in 2018. And also Fashion Dongya, which is which means Discovery East Asia New Star and came out from New Star Press in 2018. Last but not least, Chelsea Nguyen has worked at the UN Development Program in Indonesia and East Timor between 2019 and 2022. And prior to this, in the UN Economic and Social Commission for the Asia Pacific in Thailand, working on survey data collection and analysis, rural economic development, peace building, and trade policy. Chelsea has also intimate experience with the UN-led post-war reconciliation effort between Indonesia and East Timor following the latter's independence referendum in 1999 and has published on the topic. Her other research interests are found in the intersections of global history, historical sociology, and comparative politics, especially on the 20th century Cold War and revolutions in Vietnam and Communist Asia. So today's topic on Cold War and Asian modernity is really to kind of revisit this Cold War discourse, or Cold War 2.0, that refers to the standoff between US and China. It may also be worth remembering that the first Cold War in the 20th century has never ended in Asia, as evidenced by the ongoing political situations on the Korean Peninsula, where the war between the North and South has technically continuing, and also the situation surrounding the Taiwan Strait as well. So today, our three speakers will be responding to these two questions. The first question we consider is, how has Cold War figured into the rather controversial modernization process of East and Southeast Asia, as well as the various critical imaginaries of modernity across the regions? Given also that the fact that this Cold War discourse has been largely produced in the hegemonic global north, and we are discussing the implication of this on East and Southeast Asia, the speakers are also asked to think about how the scholars from East and Southeast Asia can position themselves in this conscious effort to reconfigure knowledge production as part of the decolonization agenda, and also as part of challenging the dominant discourse on Cold War, whether it be it in a 1.0 or 2.0. So these two sets of questions are something for speakers to address, and we give about 15 minutes for each speaker. And we hope to have rich Q&As after each speaker's initial intervention. So we start with Seung-Ok. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shin. So let me share my slide. So could you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Seung-Ok Lee. As you can see from my first page of the slide, the left side, you can see that the West now discussing the end of the post-Cold War. However, the photos of the center is the border city of the Korea, and the other one is the photo from the Taiwan island. So both three photos share the scene of the so-called anti-tank barrier, which means that the Cold War, the remnant are still working in East Asia. So I want to talk about starting with this kind of the article. So I think many of you read this one, but this piece published by Jake Sullivan. He's now the National Security Advisor of the U.S. In his paper, he talked about very important announcement. So here he argued that the post-Cold War is now definitely over. So the National Security Advisor of the U.S. announced that now the post-Cold War is ended, and now more competition pervading every aspect of the international politics. Here in this paper, he kind of distinguished three different the phases of the U.S. global role after the Second World War II. The first is naturally the old Cold War. It's about the democracy and containing the communism. And second stage is the post-Cold War, is the neoliberal globalization. And here, the third, the stage is that he defined that now US is now encountering strategic competition in an age of the interdependence and transnational challenges. So he tried to distinguish three different stages in the US global role in the world. However, my point is that, as Professor Shin stressed, that East Asia is now entering a new Cold War. However, the dynamics of the old Cold War and the post-Cold War are still in play and in the region. So try to understand this question. I have some two questions to think about. The first one is that I try to use the angle of so-called the security and development nexus. So my question is that how the wax and wane of the US-led security development nexus going from the old Cold War through the post-Cold War to new Cold War. The second question, because I'm a geographer, my focus is how are the colonial legacies still in play in the region, especially in territorial terms. So like the photo in the right, the downside, you can see still everyone knows that the territorial dispute is intense in East Asia. So I try to use these two different questions to understand the first question. First, let me start with the construction of the US-led security development nexus during the Cold War. So kind of US during the Cold War, the US provided both the security and development and in the region, and expecting that the enhancing security will facilitate the development in Asia. Also, development also helped the stable security. So this led to so-called the compressed modernization in East Asia, which means that the many Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and even China achieved fast economic growth with authoritarian politics. However, the problem is that there are still unresolved colonial legacies. It complicates the East Asian geopolitics as well as the domestic politics. Especially, the problem is that, as I mentioned, the territorial conflict still ongoingly disrupt any possibility for regional integration in Asia, such as there's a South Korea, between the South Korea and Japan, there's a Dokdo-Takeshima conflict, and South China Sea, East China Sea, and especially the inter-Korean, the maritime border issue is still heavily influencing the East Asian geopolitics. And more problem is that these kind of some territorial issues now perpetuate the imperial intervention in the region. So in sum, I think East Asian countries encountered the Cold War in the middle of the incomplete decolonization and ongoing territorial division and conflict. And this order is now weakened since the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. So we are now, we can see that there's kind of disintegration of the so-called US-led security development nexus during the post-Cold War. And this comes with a very unique situation. So US still provide the security service to the region. However, they are increasing their pressure in terms of the trade in the countries such as Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. So this led to the new structure called the many Asian countries is now some geo-economic relationship with the China. On the other hand, still depend on the US in terms of security. However, my point is that so-called destabilization of the Cold War regime, so-called disrupt the long-standing territorial regimes in East Asia. So this opens some new opportunities for constructing an alternative geopolitical economic order in East Asia. And for the first time in the regional history, in modern regional history, this order is neither fully dictated nor controlled by the US. So two major phenomena is that debordering on the both Korean Peninsula and also the Taiwan Strait. So Korean Peninsula enjoys some the new geo-economic interconnection between the South and North Korea. Also, Taiwan and China also set up some new geo-economic link called the Three Links. So this is an example of the inter-border economic cooperation between South Korea and North Korea. So there's a special economic zones in Kaesong and the Kumgang Mountain area, now both gone. And especially so, I and the Professor Jamie Doucette in the University of Manchester, we tried to describe the situation using the concept, the volatile territorialities in Korean Peninsula. So, and this kind of disintegration of the US-led security development nexus is actually intensified under so-called the Trump. So here I want to talk about the impact of the Trump in East Asian geopolitics. So you may know that for the first time in regional history, there's a first summit meeting between the North Korea leader and the US, like you can see here. And regarding this meeting, again, Jamie Doucette and I wrote a short piece about this Trump's impact on the East Asian geopolitics. So here we discussed that, well, the election of Trump definitely produced upheavals in East Asia as much in the West. However, this is quite contradictory. No doubt, the Trump as a president becomes a major threat to the liberal global order, especially in the West and the US. However, we argue that we cannot deny the fact that the Trump shaken up the Cold War division system in the Korean Peninsula, even though a new Cold War with China is now intensifying. So no doubt that inter-Korean engagement is a product of the long-standing kind of democracy activism in South Korea. However, we cannot deny that the inter-Korean improvement and the regional improvement is also linked with the Trump. However, now we are encountering the regional order called the new Cold War, and the so-called the temporary debordering is now finished, and we are now encountering so-called the rebordering in East Asia. So this kind of inter-Korean military pact is broken down last year, and now there's more and more the military provocation from the North Korea, and then there's the inter-Korean relationship is now worsening and worsening. And this also we can see here China-Taiwan relationship also becoming more and much more tense. And this kind of situation is now leading to so-called consolidation of the US, Japan, and South Korea alliance. And also this kind of Russia and the North Korea relationship is now getting much more closer. So in sum, my focus is that the East Asian countries achieve very fast accelerate growth. However, still we have some unfinished tasks, such as the decolonization and de-Cold War and territorial unification. Especially, as I mentioned, that territorial issues, territorial division, territorial conflict consistently disrupt the construction of the alternative modernity through the allowing the imperial powers constantly intervene in the region. So this is I took this picture in the DMZ in Korea, and here the DMZ is not controlled by the South Korean government. Actually, the United Nations Command actually control this area. So anyway, so my point is that regarding the first question, so without addressing the so-called the three tasks, decolonization, de-Cold War, territorial unification, it is growingly difficult to construct some alternative modality in East Asia. So that's it for the first question. So I think I need to finish here and then maybe back to the next question later.
Thank you so much. I think that's very interesting viewpoint, especially regarding the unfinished tasks of decolonization, de-Cold War, and territorial unification, kind of guiding us through the recent history as well as mid-20th century and all the way up to the recent politics as a result of the Trump administration and what comes afterwards. Maybe we can move to Nianshen right away. Over to you, Nianshen.
Thank you, Professor Sheng. And just now, Professor Lee, a geographer, provide a very brilliant talk, to lead us to understand the spatial sort of dimension of the Cold War. I'm a historian, so maybe I can talk about the temporal, or the Cold War involved in time, how to really understand the so-called Cold War in East Asia from the time perspective. As both Professor Lee and Professor Shin just mentioned, Cold War never end in East Asia. I completely agree with that, but I will also add on that the Cold War was never cold in East Asia, right? When we talk about Cold War, the textbook definition of the Cold War begin with the Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill in 1946 and end in 1991 when Soviet Union dissolved itself. But when we try to, the basic feature of this so-called Cold War was it was not a real war. It's an ideological warfare launched by the two leading nations or leading hegemons in the world. One is communist camps, the other is capitalist camp or liberal camps. But when we try to apply these definitions to East Asia scenario, it was, something is wrong. We would never really quite fit to this scenario, to this definition. Not only because the Cold War never ended, not only because the Cold War, when we think about when did the Cold War started in East Asia, the starting point is also very blurred. Is this really started in 1946? Can this starting point really help us to understand the Cold War in East Asia? For example, the Taiwan issue or the separation of North and South Korea. How can we really understand, all the territorial disputes that mentioned by Professor Lee just now from the Cold War perspective? So this is all very challenging questions. The other thing is, I think the Cold War in East Asia is very much shaped by the three interconnected wars, real wars, hot wars in East Asia, namely, number one, the Chinese Civil War between the communist and the nationalist parties. Number two, the Korean War, which as the first war is a war never ended, right? Never officially ended. And the third, the Vietnam War. And when we talk about the Vietnam War, it was not just one war. Let me remind you that Vietnam War is a series of wars that we can maybe call it an Indochina War, right? From the beginning, it was an anti-colonial war between the Vietnam and the French colonizers. And then United States jumped in order to contain so-called spread of red threats in Southeast Asia, then became a war between North Vietnam and against South Vietnam and United States. And there was a third Indochina War, which started with the border war between China and Vietnam, and also including the Vietnam's war with Cambodia. So this is a serious kind of hot war happening in the 20th century East Asia. So this is why we think not only the starting point and end point were questionable in East Asia of the Cold War, but the very term of Cold War itself is questionable. When talking about the starting point, I want to remind you that whether we talk about the issue of Taiwan, the cross-Taiwan Strait issue, or the separation of South and North Korea, it never happened in the 1940s, right? We have to understand the Japanese colonization in order to understand both political issues, right? So it goes way beyond 1945, 1946, and way into the colonial and imperial period. I don't have to give you more details about how the Japanese expansion in East Asia create all these problems, and how the anti-colonization or decolonization were basically cut out by the intervention of United States and Soviet Union in East Asia. Well, in the Chinese Civil War, the role of Soviet Union and United States was hidden, right? They didn't really directly involve in the first hot war in Cold War East Asia, but both countries did directly involve in the second and third hot wars, which is the Korean War, and also the Indochina War, to some different extent. And the what happening in East Asia, how the Soviet Union and United States took part in the Chinese Civil War and the Korean War and the Vietnam War had a lot significance in shaping the global Cold War scenario. Let me mention just one point. The Soviet Union ended in 1991. By the time the second year, China and South Korea established official diplomatic relations, and Russia also established recognized South Korea. But until nowadays, North Korea was not recognized by United States, and the diplomatic relations between North Korea and Japan had never been officially established. So there was a very prolonged process. So how to understand all these overlapped contradictions and issues, right, across over 100 years historical process in order to understand the so-called Cold War in East Asia? I think the first question mentioned the modernization process. It's a very useful framework and lens for us to understand. Modernization means many, many things, right? I usually tend not to use the term modernization, but becoming modern, right? Modernization in the historical sort of sense always refers to what Fairbanks said, the westernization, right? Departing from the tradition and embracing modern. But I think it's more complicated than that. It means many, many things, but if we take the political sense, from the perspective of forming a new kind of nation state in East Asia, then we can probably think about the modernization or becoming modern process in East Asia as nation building and state building, or to be more precise, nation rebuilding and state rebuilding. Because all the modern nations in nowadays East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, they have a very long history. It's not to say that before the coming of Western power, they don't have a state. No, it's not like in Southeast Asia or some African countries. They have a very long history, and they have a very sort of mature state formation, last hundreds, if not thousand years. So what happened in the 19th and 20th century was really the response to the Western sort of colonial impact, and use the traditional resources and traditional values to rebuild itself, right, to forming a new kind of nations. Hence, the along this process, we witnessed a lot of contradictions, we witnessed lots of conflicts, including territorial dispute. Why the territorial disputes happen so many times and repeatedly in East Asia? Because East Asia countries share a lot of common space, common frontiers. It's never needed a clear-cut boundary, right? But it was precise because this nation rebuilding and state rebuilding process, suddenly we need a very linear and abstract state boundary, modern boundaries, right? So you can see that almost every country had some kind of territorial dispute with another, right? Professor Lee just mentioned many of them, but I should also mention there was a territorial dispute between Japan and Russia still, right, as well. So in that case, I think this is a long sort of process which was interrupted by the bilateral competition between Soviet Union and United States in East Asia. And one of the results of these interruption was that the historical legacies in East Asia was overlapped to each other, and the previous problem haven't been solved and new problems come in. when we look at Taiwan Strait, when we look at the 38 parallels, we can clearly see that there was colonial legacies never solved. It was interrupted by the Cold War, and the Cold War conflict never solved, and it was interrupted by the so-called post-Cold War conflict, like the North Korean nuclear issues, so on and so forth. So this is create a dilemma, right? It's really a problematic dilemma in East Asia when we think about Cold War. No matter we name it, Cold War or not, no matter what we made it, whether it's the Cold War 1.0 or 2.0, it was a historical phenomenon. So this is my take on the first question, because we have so many unsolved historical problems that made the Cold War in East Asia form its very unique features, which not only defined our past, but also our present and probably in our future. Let me stop here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nianshen. I think there was also a brilliant intervention asking this question of when did the Cold War ever begin and when did it ever end? Especially taking us through the history of bit of the 19th and also 20th and 21st centuries, giving this temporal perspective on this very question, especially thinking about the whole nation rebuilding, state rebuilding processes in the 20th century in East Asia, effectively interrupted, disturbed by the colonial imperial intervention. Many of the colonial legacies and corridor controversies that have emerged in the 20th century never fully resolved, and creating further dilemma as the world enters into a new geopolitical orders that we come across nowadays. So we probably come back to some of these questions hopefully during the Q&A time. But last but not least, we move on to Chelsea. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll share the screen. So I will respond to both questions in one go within 15 minutes. And don't worry if you can't read everything in each slide. I will take a comparative historical perspective in the context of Vietnam. The 20th century Asia was the main theater for some of the world's most epoch-shattering movements for national liberation, revolution, and Cold War superpower competition through hot wars confrontations with permanent legacies. Nowhere else was this theater most radically battled with reverberating jolts to societies across the world than in modern Vietnam, which was born out of the 20th century's longest and most violent revolutions and wars. In 2023, Vietnam became the only country in the world that received the heads of states of both the United States and China. It became yet another symbolic manifestation of its centrality in past and present modern superpower rivalries, including during the first global Cold War. Standing in a podium in front of the presidential palace in Hanoi in September 2003, President Joe Biden became the first ever to have been formally received by General Secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party in this manner. Moreover, it was from the Communist Party office that Biden and Nguyen Phu Trọng, noting among other reasons their shared past struggle against fascism during World War II, that they formally announced the elevation of ties to the highest level within Vietnam's hierarchy of diplomatic relations. In one hand, while it is more or less all about China for the United States, on the other hand, Vietnam's keen interest to integrate itself deeper into US-led networks of trade, investment, supply chains, innovation, and technologies in support of its own drive for economic growth, development, and its own evolving and contentious notions of modernity. Prior to this, ties with South Korea had already been elevated to the highest level in December 2022, which had formally marked the end in which this hierarchy had been filled with exclusively Vietnam's ideologically like-minded allies and partners along socialism and third worldist non-alignment from the Cold War, namely Russia, China, and India, and furthermore, Laos, Cambodia, and Cuba, three countries that enjoy special relationships with Vietnam. But politically, the Communist Party leadership sought Biden's visit as an affirmation to its rule. In other words, central to the party-led elevation of ties with the US was also regime security and an external recognition of the Communist Party's ruling legitimacy. Later in December 2023, it was China's President Xi Jinping's turn to visit Hanoi, which Vietnam regarded as yet another historical milestone. This had preceded Chiang's visit to Beijing following the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress a month earlier, which leadership of both Communist parties have ever since framed as having been historic. The joint statements during both Chiang's visit to Beijing and Xi's visit to Hanoi were not only the longest ever issued, but also the most ideologically framed since the end of the Cold War in 1991, by pressing on, quote, defending the party and the socialist regime in each country in the new situation, end of quote. Or in other words, a defense of official socialism as they understand it. Indeed, notwithstanding ongoing territorial and maritime disputes in the South China Sea, Sino-Vietnamese ties politically deepened throughout 2022 and 2023, with frequent exchange between Beijing and Hanoi. In 2023, Chinese capital became the largest source of the number of newly registered foreign direct investment projects into Vietnam, worth $4.5 billion US dollars, only behind Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong in terms of dollar value. This recent development signified that Vietnam has once again become a battleground in the US-China competition, though no longer between global capitalism, but solely underpinned by the logics of global capitalism alone. In one hand, while it is true that Vietnam, whose nearly 40 years of market-oriented economic reforms, and furthermore decades of sustained public investments in basic human capital, as overseen by an overall highly developmentalist Communist Party, has become the biggest outlier from the other developing countries at similar income per capita levels, according to the World Bank. On the other hand, it is worth appreciating the value of the late British historian E.P. Thompson and his historiographic approach to the English Industrial Revolution and the well-being of its working class at that time, in terms of how both developmental progress and developmental regressions, for whom and by what, can take place at the same time during such transformations. As of speaking, Vietnam's economy is at its most difficult situation since the launching of market reforms in 1986, marked by growth slowdown and increasing social precarity and inequalities. Vietnam received widespread praise for its COVID-19 management during the first 2 years of the pandemic. But once the virus of the Delta variant got out of control, starting from June 21, in Ho Chi Minh City and across several southern regional manufacturing hubs, tens of thousands of factory workers ended up being overworked and languishing inside production and assembly lines under a temporary workplace regime of producing, quarantining, and sleeping at the spot, meant to only last for 3 weeks, but in practice went on for several months. Indeed, with recent years of increasing media reportage and public attention to the impoverished quality of life for many Vietnamese factory workers, one such media reportage of a landless workers couple in their late 40s from rural southern Vietnam, being one of the over 1,000 workers laid off from a footwear company in late 2022, depicted the following, quote, "For 10 years, they've never ever once gone out for eating or enjoying leisure. They've only been working, cooking, sleeping, and waking up for work," end of quote. One approach of historiography and debates about what constitutes as modern Vietnam has conventionally begun by the question of when modernity, understood as liberal and capitalist universalism of European origins, arrived in Vietnam. Did it arrive by Chinese civilization, French civilization, 20th century revolutions, and so on? This question often comes with the intentions of, one, placing a fixated time demarcation for the arrival of modernity into Vietnam, and two, compressing modernity as a single notion divorced from both ancient non-European notions of modernity, as well as its actual manifestations outside the European sphere, both by imposition and voluntarily, that forced up an alternative modernities in direct challenge to its capitalist precepts and in the colonial context of Vietnam. were attempts to overcome ancient spatial, ethnic, and cultural confinements and contradictions for universalist political imaginaries and solutions. I appreciate this seminar's emphasis on when modernity began and the value as much as the discontents of a plurality of contending modernities themselves, but on what kind of modernity and their lingering legacies that we should contemplate on in the context of today's global predicaments concerning Asia and the hot war. What is the politics behind the plurality of each modernity? In the context of Vietnam, I shall highlight the bygone 20th century attempts of universalist notions of modernity beyond capitalism, specifically about revolutionary modernity and its communist orientations, its ideological nature and its political economy, and why and how it came about in terms of 1, its triggering transnational and national, and 2, its lingering legacy state for the better or worse, and what has perished as a contrast to past and present Vietnam. I define revolutionary modernity as the pursuit of justice and emancipation in the context of collective supplications that demand transnational endeavors to collect and stand for the hopes of broadly defined identity-based social groups that face political restrictions to be necessarily upended locally and globally. Its communist orientations in practice necessitated positioning and mobilizing such social groups by peasant majority class nationalism in the context of being colonized as a means towards a social revolution. By my attention to revolutionary communist modernity, I also make it clear that in this talk, I will talk about revolutionary and communist Vietnam, and not about the other non-communist, monarchical, and republican Vietnams that came about from different notions of Asia and global modernity. As for the global South, especially in the 2 years, many major countries have been saying that they are the voice of the global South. But what kind of a global South? Is the same question as what kind of a modernity? What are they evoking and professing in terms of politics? So by global South, I refer to an overtly socialist camp within the 20th century non-aligned third world, where Vietnam's self-perceived identity once belonged. And it carries therefore 2 evolving realities as well as enduring desires and unfinished political projects. 1, which is the current attraction around the world of traditional imaginaries of oneself, and secondly, a reawakening of this lost mission and rich heritage of Asia. So by this, I explicitly try to avoid 3 tendencies. 1, to legitimize the presupposition of a homogeneous and single modernity as underpinned by global capitalism. 2, the dangers of treating distinctions as North versus South or West versus non-West as inherently opposing political spheres. And 3, what Amartya Sen calls the dialectics of the colonized mind, as a reactive fixation with the West in both admiration and resentment for one's self-understanding and self-identification, especially in terms of a needless hostility to democracy, personal liberty, and scientific and intellectual histories as mistakenly Western, and I would add depoliticized creations alone. Running a highly extractive and repressive colonial administration to extort taxes, natural resources, and native labor and soldiers for imperial wars, Indochina, comprising present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was the most impoverished among all French colonies. Combined with an overall nascent indigenous merchant tradition among especially the Vietnamese, in comparison to the European and Chinese expatriates, most of the largely peasant local populations lived under subsistence level modes of survival. It was under such suffering circumstances that a plurality of ideas about revolutionary modernity emerged among Vietnam's late 19th century and early 20th century intellectuals and activists. They all held shared desires to awaken and build new Vietnamese intellectual traditions, underpinned by democracy, egalitarianism, and humanism beyond conservative Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism and Orthodox Buddhism, that was confined to a small ruling Mandarin elite beyond the reach of the majority peasantry. They sought to equally critique Western philosophy, tainted by the contradictions of egalitarian republicanism at home and colonialism abroad, and Eastern philosophers, and to eclectically bring such cosmopolitan knowledge for defining modernity closer to the peasant masses, and to bring about emancipation via education of the intellect and the mind, and various forms of anti-colonial political mobilizations. But they all had a contentious relationship with the post-revolutionary France. Broadly speaking, while some advocated for Indo-Chinese freedoms by clinging to the hope for reformist and egalitarian assimilationist France, as well as imperial Japan, figures as Ho Chi Minh would by 1919 be disillusioned about such hopes and the merits of modernities underpinned by colonial and imperial capitalism that for him tainted both France and Japan. Ho would eventually resort to Leninist communism. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, Ho published a wide range of polemical essays that highlighted the contradictions of French civilization at home and across its colonies. There are three fundamental reasons why Ho, in the end, decisively moved beyond colonial modernity. One, frustrations with liberal universalism by colonial France's differing treatments of the colored colonized peoples. On this, Ho often wrote empathetically for the anti-colonial and revolutionary proletarian, peasant, and intellectual struggles across the French colonial world, China, Russia, Korea, Japan, India, the Pacific, Europe, North America, and more, connecting the fate of Indochina to that of the world at war and revolution. Secondly, frustrations by the indifference among Western communist parties to the inseparable colonial and national questions. And thirdly, frustrations by the mass mobilizing ineffectiveness of political programming and organizations within the early international communist and non-communist revolutionary movements. At the 7th Congress of the Communist International in 1933 and elsewhere, the Vietnamese female communist revolutionary Nguyen Thi Minh Khai denounced patriarchal tendencies within male-dominant communist parties and stressed about how female revolutionaries needed to carry the special task of women's liberation. She said, quote, "Even if the revolution is successful, the cause of women's liberation still has to continue." Sorry if you can't read this. Nonetheless, the early development of Vietnamese socialist internationalism eventually made Ho and his fellow to firmly define and position Vietnam's imaginaries of global modernity within the Sino-Soviet communist world, in which the hopes for national liberation and social revolution in Vietnam and across Asia were especially placed most intimately on the fate of revolutionary China. In fact, China was where Ho spent his longest time abroad, 11 years. Many early 20th century Vietnamese communist and non-communist revolutionary figures wrote extensively in empathy for Chinese suffering. Immersed totalization of Vietnamese revolutionary modernity into socialist internationalism consolidated itself most profoundly during France's armed attempt of recolonizing Vietnam between 1946 and 1954, or the First Indochina War. The significance of these years is twofold, by national and global dimension. It is during these years that national liberation and social revolutions were practically inseparable from each other, as seen by the Communist Corps of the Viet Minh, a coalition of communist and non-communist independent forces. And two, between 1949 and 1954 years marked the entry of the global Cold War into Asia, starting with the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949. This event changed the nature of the communist-led warfare against France across Indochina, from that of a primarily guerrilla warfare to a conventional warfare, by the political, diplomatic, economic, and military assistance from the new PRC to the Vietnamese communists. Marking the internationalization of the First Indochina War, Gosha calls this the beginning of the creation of Sino-Vietnamese war communism as a model of state building, which Vietnam later would implement for communist warfare and state building in Laos and Cambodia. In other words, the 1949 Chinese Revolution and its immediate internationalized outcomes, as manifested by New China's interventions into both the Korean and Indo-Chinese peninsulas, can be said to mark the entry of the global Cold War into Asia. In this process, the Vietnamese communists themselves were as decisive. A globalizing revolutionary Vietnam further emerged, and even more bloodily during the Vietnam War or the American War. The war made Vietnam into a coalescing and clustering global moment for various protests, solidarity, and peace movements and peoples and countries around the world. Following the Third Congress of Vietnam Workers' Party in North Vietnam in 1963, Ho Chi Minh was in effect replaced by Lê Duẩn to be practically in charge of the armed warfare against the United States. This new communist leadership accelerated Vietnamese socialist internationalism to radical dimensions by both, one, subscribing to the Chinese Maoist line by an embrace for revolutionary militancy in South Vietnam, second, communist struggle as a socialist internationalist duty, especially towards neighboring Laos, Cambodia, and South Asia, as a vanguard for third world liberation movements, and ultimately as a contribution to a war revolution of defeating colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. It sought to demonstrate that small states were capable of impacting the world, influencing the international system, and transcend the all-powerful Cold War bipolarity. At times, both Beijing and Moscow were frightened by Vietnam's termed utopianism. Following the communist victory and unification in 1975 and 6, various attempts at national liberation and revolution continued across Central and South Americas and the Middle East until the early 1980s. Until this day, the Vietnam Syndrome, or 1968, continues to be evoked across various contemporary wars and conflicts. In a new book released just this month, I quote, "The Third Indochina War portended the apparent meltdown of Asian internationalism. The year of 1979 marked the beginning of a new phase in the imaginings of Asia as a political signifier and as a method of scholarly inquiry that gave interferential Asia as a fresh lease of life in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The significance of memories from the wars with China and the Cameroon should not be understated as growing sources."
Chelsea,
Yeah.
would you mind probably kind of wrapping up in about a minute, so that we can perhaps go through the remaining part of the seminar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so in conclusion, the Vietnamese Communist Party Congress in 2021 marked a re-ideologization of elite politics, in which an officially proceeded to official socialism was confirmed. Conclude that it is that these articulations at the elite level are very distant to the realities on the ground, and how we today, in comparison to 1 year ago, should reflect on how activists, intellectuals, and political leaders across revolutionary Asia were capable of thinking so progressively and empathetically for each other. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was very comprehensive and insightful, especially taking the comparative historical perspective, as you were noting, also guiding us through this issue of revolutionary communist modernity, how it was emerging throughout the history in relation to the imperial and colonial powers, how it was kind of navigating itself through the whole history of 20th century Vietnam, and also in relation to neighboring the conflicts that have occurred with the neighboring economies as well. I think this context in the contending modernities and as a result of those and how those were kind of navigated by the leaderships in Vietnam. Fascinating story. Before we kind of open the floor to further Q&A, can I just invite Nianshen and Seung-Ok in that order, just briefly to respond to share your thought about the positioning of scholars in relation to this hegemonic discourse making, and something Chelsea was trying to touching upon. It will be useful to have the views of Nianshen and Seung-Ok before we open the floors to the audience. So maybe over to you, Nianshen. Maybe 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be very quick, and really appreciate Chelsea mentioning very important features of the East Asian modernity, which is the revolution. All the countries, Korea, China, and Vietnam, had a very significant sort of historical process called a revolution. But let me remind you that revolution is never a revolution against colonization or imperialism. Of course, national independence is one part of it, but the revolution has another aspect, which is the internal revolution, which is to reconstructing the social classes and social structure in order to pave the way towards industrialization. The real significant revolution in all the countries, I think, is not the war against colonizers, but land reform. Right? Land reform really mobilized the peasantries in the rural, in the urban, in the countryside, and paved the way towards modern industrialization and urbanization. And because of this land reform, and this is the economic development after that was heavily oriented by the state, the so-called central planning economy, that when the Soviet collapsed in the 1991, the so-called Cold War ended in 1991, that provide not a risk, but an opportunity, especially for China, to sort of, embracing this marketization reform, because Soviet Union used to regard it as the number one external threat to China's national security. And what happened in the 1990s and afterward was another kind of challenge to the revolutionary legacy, which is the new so-called neoliberal reformation that created some kind of new social problem. But because of the revolutionary legacy, I think those leaders in China and Vietnam will automatically think about what is the goal of the revolution. One of them is to eliminate the huge gap between the poor and the rich that created by the market-oriented capitalization process. And that, I think, is a very important sort of reminder for us to think about the contemporary so-called North vis-a-vis South dichotomy, because we clearly see that with democratization reform, the old demarcation between South and North were no longer sort of clear in the world. By that, I mean that we can see the first world and the third world within a country. I mean, the contracts between the rich and poor increase a lot. That happened not only in China, but also in many, many other countries, including United States, including, I believe, Vietnam as well. So nowadays, when we think about North, so-called global North and global South, it was never one nation state against another nation state, or the organization of nation state against another, but very much a discussion about what happened within one nation state. So this is create a new sort of challenge for thinking, for a discussion about what we talk about global South. Who belongs to the South, right? It's not to say that China belongs to global South or China belongs to global North, but global South and global North is very much embedded within China, and as is embedded within the United States. So this, I think, is a new sort of way to reconfigure our current discussion about the world economy and world politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Seung-Ook, over to you.
Okay, let me share my slide quickly. So yeah, so regarding the second question about the global North and South and knowledge production in Asia, I think about what is the development discourse in Korea. So after the Korean War, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the world Rostow, the godfather of the modernization, is quite popular in Korea. So his word, the takeoff in Korean, 도약, was really popular among Korean. And after that, this book by the Jong-taek Kim introduced the next developed discourse, dominant developed discourse in Korea is called it's becoming the advanced country, advanced nation, 선진국. Like here, the concept of the 선진국 is a national goal for South Korea. So, and this is the history mission So we need to enter into this kind of, the global north, advanced nation, which means that, state is now definitely the dominate this discussion, this discourse, but also intellectuals and society also join this discussion. And this is about the 1990s and 1980s. And nowadays in contemporary period, I think one of the dominant development discourse in Korea, in contemporary Korea, is the so-called, we should be like the leading nation. In Korean, it's called the 선도 국가. This now occupies some key position in the government developed discourse. So for example, this is the previous South Korean liberal President Moon Jae-in here, that through the Korean New Deal, we need to create a world leading nation. Here in this kind of some retirement speech, we are taking a kind of big step forward towards becoming a leading nation. And this is definitely thanks to kind of people, something like that, great people, great nation. And in another paper, in South Korea, there's a very heavy the popularity about the so-called fourth industrial revolution era. And here, the President Moon suggested our goal is no longer to catch up. It's time to lead a new era of the digital economy. That's the new developed desire. The South Korean, the president, government, and even societies all kind of focusing on here. So here, this is the kind of golden opportunity. So we should transform the South Korean economy. Is no longer the follower. We should be kind of the pace-setting one. So from the fast follower to the first mover, so becoming the first mover leading nation is dominant in South Korea, and not just under the liberal regime. So this is the current kind of conservative regime in the President Yoon Suk-yeol, and one of his key tasks is that we should be a global leading nation. And in terms of the value, freedom, peace, and prosperity, he also mentioned that from the follower in the science and technology, and we should be a leading nation in advanced technology. So my point is that instead of imagining some kind of alternative modality beyond the global north and south, both liberal and conservative powers in Korea now channeling a very strong development desire. We should join and now even lead the global north, from the digital revolution to the green or energy revolution. So the government and society, and even media and academia share this desire. The problem is that this developed desire has nothing to do with kind of more just or equal modality. And the problem is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, new Cold War, deepening, intensifying the inter-Korean crisis, leaves no room for the imagination of the alternative modality. So decolonize, de-Cold War, and deterritorialize modality. In other words, this kind of condition make it kind of challenging to go beyond existing dichotomy in knowledge production, which means that critical scholars in Korean society is now losing the power to imagine and even spread some alternative modality beyond the global south and global north. So my point is that to construct an alternative modality in Korea and even East Asia, I think we need to kind of free from this kind of disruptive and violent relationship with the imperial powers. And that is, I think, the most kind of profounding the task, maybe first task, to create some alternate modality in Korea. So no longer we should be like the global north. We should leading the global north. Now it's time to create a new alternative model, something like that. That's it for my thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I mean, the topic itself was a huge topic. Probably in this 70-minute session was never going to be enough. It leaves us about 7 minutes, before the end of today's session. Probably not enough time for extended Q&As, it seems. But we did benefit heavily from our insightful interventions by our three speakers. Perhaps just one or two questions from the audience, if there's any kind of question or comments that you want to raise. I don't think there's any question posted on Q&A in a section. And I'm looking at the chat window.
So Bing-Chuan had posed a question.
Was there a question?
Yeah, I put it in the Q&A box.
Can
Can you see it?
somehow my Q&A box doesn't actually say anything. Maybe it's my access to Q&A seems to be a bit limited. Bing-Chen, would you mind just kind of sharing your comment input directly?
Yeah, so my question is for all the panelists, even though it's initially derived from Seung-Ook mentioning of the coexistence of old Cold War, post-Cold War, and new Cold War orders in Asia. And I just wonder, while it's crucial to acknowledge the historical continuation, what the panelists would say about some of the key differences between the old and new Cold War, with the caveat that the old never ended and it was never cold.
And perhaps I think that maybe is sufficient given the remaining time. Does any of the panel members want to respond to Bing-Chen's, Professor Monk's question? I can see first Nianshen, maybe start with
Well,
you.
for me, you know, I don't really buy the term Cold War, not to mention the new Cold War. So for me, it was not so much, you know, the question of differences, but what are the common challenges that we are facing now? The so-called new Cold War, as far as I, you know, based on my limited reading, it was referring to the current confrontation between U.S. and China in the many, you know, non-military field, like technology, like science and trade, and so on and so forth. But that was, for me, it was you know, a continuation of unfinished becoming modern process for China, right? So it was because of this new challenge, which laid on the new challenge, that made these confrontation had a very sort of salient historical sort of a burden with it. When we think about the current confrontation, we think about the colonization period, we think about the so-called 100 years colonization, so on and so forth. So for me, the first thing is I don't think there was a so-called Cold War in East Asia, and there is not a new sort of this kind of war confrontation in East Asia. In China, I can only say that in China, the huge challenge was still remain the same, which is how to deal with the so-called, you know, the impact of capitalization, marketization, and the new colonization. This, I think, is my very immature answer to Bing-Chen's very thought-provoking question.
Given the reference to Seung-Ook, perhaps let me invite Seung-Ook to respond to this.
Yeah, as Nianshen mentioned that there's a controversy around should we call this time as a new Cold War? And I'm mostly my idea is that we all know that old Cold War is more about kind of separate block, but now the new Cold War is after the globalization, which means that we are all intertwined. So even though, well, the U.S. government first used the decoupling, now they are using the de-risking. We know that it's kind of almost impossible to, you know, the cut off this so-called intertwined economic relationship. Also, as Jake Sullivan mentioned, that U.S. strategy against China is that we are promoting competition with the cooperation. So competition in economy, technology, and blah, blah, blah. But we also promote the cooperation in transnational challenges such as a climate crisis. The problem is that I think one of the key difference between the old and new Cold War is that now we are facing the common transnational challenges we need to solve together. But the problem is that I think that we all know that the so-called we can do some cooperation and competition together. So the U.S. government and official using that we can walk and chew gum together, walk and chew gum. But I highly doubt it. Can we, where we compete each other and then cooperate in the other side? I think that's not possible, which means that that's quite pessimistic because we are now getting much more difficult, impossible to face this kind of the climate crisis. But we are now seeing more intensifying the competition between the two sides. So that's my thought.
Chelsea, any the kind of final concluding word from you?
I agree with Professor Lee. We live in a time of very unique transnational challenges that actually require us to collaborate, in the spirit of the old phrase internationalism. But I'm also very skeptical, as Professor Lee, about the capacity and the will to overcome, I would say, very narrow-minded nationalism in many countries these days. Compared to people, intellectuals 100 years ago, now we are becoming more territorial, not just between Asia and the United States, but even with between India and China, Southeast Asia, etc. As for the new aspects of this so-called new Cold War compared to the past, it's very difficult for me in the context of Vietnam to conclude decisively, because how I abruptly ended my presentation about the Communist Party Congress in 2021, it affirmed commitment to official socialism. In the world, Vietnam is just wars, but for some people in the elite leadership of the Communist Party, the so-called revolutionary mission goes on. They say our end goal is national independence and socialism. And even though the realities on the ground, in my opinion, are not indicating that, but these people, they mean it. So in the context of Vietnam, I would say it's more of a continuation of the old Cold War. The means to achieve their end goals might be more diverse and flexible, but in my opinion, the end goals is consistent. That's my opinion.
Great, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's probably the end of time that we have been allocated to. We discussed this in the Cold War and Asian modernity, which is a big question. Never probably not definitely not enough time to address this, and hopefully we'll continue our conversations in various other venues. Let me thank our speakers and audience members on behalf of the co-conveners of Inter-Asia Seminar Series, and also on behalf of the Southeast Asia Center for supporting this seminar series and for hosting this event. Let me also remind all the audience members that the next event SEAC is going to organize is on the 29th of April this year with the speaker Nick Paisley, who will be discussing reglobalization, geopolitics, and Southeast Asia. The next Inter-Asia Seminar Series is going to be looking at socio-economic affairs in Asia, and that's going to be on the question of youth and class. So that will be on the 31st of May, and you'll be able to learn more about the event on the SEAC event webpage at a later date. Thank you so much, our speakers and audience members, for joining us today. Look forward to welcoming you back to one of these seminars later on. Thank you very much. Goodbye.